perhaps the place that deviates the most from the norm. Because usually this type of movement is a minuet, it's rather slow and dance-like. And in Beethoven's case we get this. This is not a minuet at all, you couldn't dance a minuet to it. And as a matter of fact, he does in fact title the movement Minuet. So probably he felt when he was writing it that he was still in the framework of the tradition before him, but nevertheless he had some very different ideas that he chooses to realize. And as a matter of fact, in his subsequent symphonies, he does not call this type of movement Minuet anymore, he calls it Scherzo usually. Now as you can see, again we have a lot of scale-wise movement. There's also a lot of half steps, lots of notes that are alterated away from the C major scale, which drives the music forward and pushes it upwards. But at this point it has become much more intense than it was before that. And because of this, the third movement is the climax of the piece. It's the place where this initial careful idea of the beginning has been developed into its most wild extreme. What follows is a passage that sounds like this. This passage is developed from material that is heard at the beginning of the development section of the first movement, namely this passage. Same idea in both places. We have the half step and we move back and forth between these two notes. But again you can see how the third movement is intensified a lot compared to the first movement. The first movement is moving forward in a rather sort of laid back and cozy way. And in the third movement this is transformed into this. As a matter of fact, the culmination of this passage in the third movement cadences in D flat major. So we have gone, by using these half steps and by moving forward, by making these constant little changes, we have moved from C major to D flat major. So now even the musical floor, the musical foundation is pushed up, not just in the middle of a phrase as it was in the first movement, and then further. But now we actually cadence in D flat. We actually land in D flat major, and the whole musical tonality is pushed up by a half step. And again, this is an example of how the idea of moving up a half step is taken to an even further extreme than it was previously. The way that he modulates back to C major is again by rising half steps, and that's because he goes to the relative minor of D flat major, which is B flat minor. And then he simply rises by half steps. And again we are back in C major. And the final dramatic moment is this. See how now the idea of moving up a half step and a whole step have been intertwined. At first we hear it like this, and then faster, which raises the intensity even further. And after this we get the final cadence of the section. The trio section contrasts the main movement by being very simple and by staying on the same harmonies a lot. Also, it has a lot of similarities, this section, to the very beginning of the symphony, because we get these moves from E to F, and back to, from F to E again, and then a cadence in G major, which contains a lot of the same elements as the first 4 bars of the whole symphony. And also the second part of the trio, which starts by being mainly on the dominant key. It has the first violins playing a lot of these little half steps, and also these 5 notes and these 5 notes, which is very similar to the material that they're playing at the beginning of the symphony. So we get the same 5 notes, and we get lots of these moving back and forth between 2 half notes. And also we get the other 5 notes. So at this point the music is reminiscent of the beginning, but the different elements are more elaborated. And also at the end of this trio section we have an elaboration on the cadence, which takes place at bar 31 to 33 in the first movement, if you remember. This has now been transformed into this. And then after the trio, the minuet is repeated. And so what characterizes the trio, since it is so simple and since the harmonies stay the same for so long, is that it provides this soothing moment in the middle of the very dramatic main movement.